Welcome to the week 19 recap of the 2025 challenge. We're going to be taking a look on today's video at days 127 through 133 in our 49-week reading challenge. So, Pastor Bruce, we're just kind of going to jump right on in today. As always, we're going to look at, kind of a recap, hopefully answer some questions. If you added comments into the Talk It Over section in the YouVersion
Were there
plan.
comments this week?
There were some this week,
Excellent.
yeah. And, we're going to have a little fun, hopefully, along the way. So we're into some different parts of the Bible. So would you begin with some prayer for us today?
May the words of our mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, our Savior and our Redeemer.
Amen. Okay, so when I say we're getting into some different parts of the Bible, I believe this was either our first or second week. Everything kind of is a blur these days, with no gospel readings. So
Don't like it.
It's let's talk about that for a moment. How are you doing with that?
I'm actually okay with it. I'm somebody who, kind of being high church religious, I don't think we read enough scripture.
I would agree. We stay where we're comfortable.
And service sometimes, because I'm somebody who says we should read the Old Testament, the New Testament, something from the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get an epistle lesson and then the gospel.
Yeah. I mean, and the argument, I think that probably went away. Just a side note here. My guess is part of that went away in churches during the kind of personal holiness, personal Jesus type movement. Wouldn't you think?
A little bit, but also I think it went away when people and churches became very concerned of we got to be done in an hour.
Done in an hour, and also very seeker friendly, which we're not saying that we shouldn't be. We should be welcoming to new people, but also we should be about the business of worship and business of the church. And so,
right.
And
hopefully we're discovering that there's so much connection between the breadth and width of Scripture that got to read it all.
Well, and that's what I was getting to. I'm glad you got there, because what I was hoping is by this point, we're, almost 5 months into this reading together, that, by the time we've gotten to this point, I hope that people are starting to go, oh, there is more to the Bible than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
And oh, wow, I can learn from this. And there is depth to that. And that is drawing me closer to Jesus. And that is helping me grow in my faith. So anyway, I am, I don't want to say concerned, but I know we had some people say, oh, I love starting the days off each day with, these familiar readings from the Gospels, and then we jump off to stuff I'm not as familiar with. For some people, we now may be into all unfamiliar territory. And so,
good.
If that's stretching you a little bit, we just want to say, keep up. You're going to be okay. We've got you there.
Hold on, baby. We haven't even got to Revelations.
Oh man. Yeah. We haven't even gotten to the letters yet. No, we haven't even gotten to the epistles. So, okay. So we're going to jump off right here on day 127. On day 127, we found ourselves in Acts chapter 6, Exodus 18, Numbers 8, and Nehemiah 13. So let's talk about what happens in Acts chapter 6 here, Pastor Bruce.
Well, the early church appoints 7 leaders to care for some of the more practical needs of the community, emphasizing the importance of shared leadership and allowing spiritual leaders to focus on prayer and teaching. And this actually really kind of reminded me of a couple things of when Moses went to God and said, I've done all these things, but now I have too much to handle. And God said, well, let's do some shared leadership. Yeah,
which is funny that you would say that, because, of course, that was our very next reading. It's almost like we prepared that, but we do, and we'll get there just in a moment. But that is when Jethro actually tells Moses, like, hey, dude, like, you need to delegate some of your authorities to some people that can do some other things for you.
And here's the thing. I think of our staff also. Is we have they're okay. We have a pretty good staff.
They're amazing.
Okay. They're phenomenal.
Yes.
But the reality is one thing when we start to go to the staff model post-COVID, because COVID, we really worked as a team.
It was just kind of all hands on deck, had to figure out how to do it. Yep.
And the first thing I think about is actually the Christmas boxes we did that year.
Oh, yeah.
Is we had the whole staff back there packing up. I was building the boxes and stuffing them with the paper, and the next person would do their little bit, and we'd pray over them and do all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think the cool thing about that is since that point, it's very much is you've had to remind me that I've got to stay in my lane. And you mean that in a very loving way of there are certain things that only I can do as the ordained elder.
Yes.
And so delegating those things to an executive director was the correct thing, but learning where that those guardrails were for you and I.
Delineation was.
Yeah.
I think it's hard. And we still struggle with that. We've had staff members that have served and, maybe are no longer serving, or even our current staff members. And I will throw myself in this pile as well to say that sometimes we want to know everything, or sometimes it's easier to just do it ourselves. Or sometimes, like in my case, there are things that, and I do those other things too, but I have some things that I still just so enjoy doing that I have a hard time delegating them off to other people. Like I love doing design work. I love doing the creative piece. And so it's hard for me to delegate those pieces, but sometimes they do become a little bit of a drag, on my time and ability to lead in other areas. And so, I think it's a great, really example that we see both here in Acts chapter 6, which really is, I think, taking, this example from what happened with Moses and saying, you know what? Like it doesn't just have to be the one person leading this congregation or this group of people. We all have a part in it. We're all the body of Christ. We've all got to do something.
I love the term priesthood of all believers.
Yes, the
because
priesthood of all believers.
It's not just the pastor that necessarily does all the priestly things. So why don't you tell us what's going on with Jethro in Exodus 18?
Well, I mean, that's just it. He just tells Moses, listen, man, you've got to delegate some of your authority. And so really talks about how we can have sustainable leadership and how, you have to do it with trustworthy people. So I can call this out, I think, fairly because it's my own dad. But before we recorded today, you actually just had a great conversation with my dad, who, among other things over the years, has been very heavy into helping manage this facility, this Jerome Church building facility. That's one of his calls, one of his gifts, and he's really good at it.
Yeah, when I first got here, there were days that I think I saw him more than some staff members.
Absolutely.
Because he was always here.
Yeah, and there's always something to do, always something to be done. The discussion that you were having with him this morning had to do with a bigger project and really trying to help him see how not only, he can still be involved in it, but that as he is, moving along kind of in his own discipleship, moving along in his own spiritual growth, that now we're coming to the time where as a leader,
he needs to teach.
The most important thing he can do instead of doing the things is actually teach others to do the things. But I'm sure for people like Moses, for people like my dad, those are not easy things to let go of.
Yeah.
Speaking
of leadership, I'm just going to call something out right now because if you heard a weird sound in the microphone, to remind people, I've had gastric bypass. I feel great, doing fantastic, but my stomach is making some weird noises today.
Okay, so we got a third man on the podcast today. Is that what you're saying?
I saw because I just saw your face and I was like, was that out loud? Did I hear that in my ears? It went. Grr.
No, it's all good.
I'm not speaking in tongues. I'm not. It's not a demon. Well, I hope it's not a demon, but we'll go from there.
We'll go from there.
All right. So why don't we go to Numbers 8? And in Numbers 8, the Levites are set apart, purified, and commissioned for service in the tabernacle. Once again, this is a passing down of power. See a theme going on here?
Yeah.
And it's illustrating that those called to serve must be spiritually prepared and consecrated.
Right.
And so, like when we do new hires at the church, one of the things is we put a spiritual kind of section in there. You don't have to attend church here.
Yeah.
But we want you attending church somewhere.
Yeah, it's a piece of it. But, I also think about, like, we just commissioned a mission team, for example.
Right.
That went off to Cuba. And, we aren't just sending volunteers down there to go do good work. We are sending followers of Christ to go do the work of Jesus, be the hands and feet of God on the ground.
And the hands and feet of God is not always what you expect it to be.
Yeah,
they didn't build houses. They didn't do that kind of thing. They gave people rice and beans and loved on them.
Absolutely. So I think what Numbers 8 is telling us here are a couple of things. First of all, I think it's an interesting contrast because Numbers 8 still is very much talking about how the priests are set aside.
Right.
And not how, we can delegate to the laity, if you will, of the time. But what we can learn from that is that in order to lead, we do have a responsibility to be spiritually prepared.
Right.
And, to be consecrated into that ministry. Help us understand that word, because that to me is kind of a churchy word. How do you understand consecration? What does that mean for you?
Very much like ordination, blessed or set aside.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You can be consecrated for a person. So blessed for a purpose.
Right.
And so they talk about consecrating the items to be used in the tabernacle. They are blessed and set aside strictly for that purpose.
Right. Okay. No, that's helpful. All right. And then finally, we've got some reading from Nehemiah 13.
And I think this reading is actually really good with what's going on here because Nehemiah, a leader consecrated for a purpose,
yes,
sometimes have to do tough things. And so he had to be spiritually in the right place and things to do what he did. And that was?
Well, he rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem. But in this case, he's actually, he shows up and sees that there is some corruption. Because if you remember the timeline, and we've talked about it on here a little bit, Nehemiah was kind of the last back,
right,
to Jerusalem. The temple had already been rebuilt. There was, Ezra was in the middle there. There's stuff that had been done. Now he shows up and he's like, oh, you guys are a mess. You're a mess.
There were people, once again, the same thing that took them off into exile is happening again. And so there's neglect of God's laws. And so he's kind of showing that ongoing vigilance that needs to happen, that the importance of accountability, that there always needs to be reform. If you take your eye off the ball, you will lose the ball.
Absolutely. Let's take this. We're talking about like our facility management for a while. Part of the reason that my dad, was here a lot is because over the years, this church is almost 190 years old as a worshiping congregation. And over the years, there were pockets of maintenance items that for whatever reason had either been overlooked or, just not done. Many things had, but we had this tyranny of the urgent. We talk about this a lot. I don't think it was that people were like, let's not fix that thing. It was just there was something else more urgent.
And there's a perfectly good story for what we're looking at right now. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I'm just like, Yeah,
there are always good reasons, but sometimes we in our, today even make decisions that maybe aren't the most forward looking.
Right.
And then someone down the road has to deal with kind of cleaning up what we didn't do. And so anyway, I think that's kind of what we're looking at here is that, that you have to have ongoing vigilance. There has to be ongoing maintenance, if you will, to your faithfulness and to righteousness, to being in right relationship with God. You can't just like put a patch on a wall and hope it holds for the next 50 years. You got to like maintain that repair.
That bubble gum looks really old. I think we need to replace it with new bubble gum to hold that thing in place.
So not calling out anybody. I do believe we are standing on the shoulders of many faithful servants here in this congregation, but I just thought it was kind of an apropos metaphor there today. So let's, go ahead.
I was going to say in day 128, let's go on to the next one, is Acts 7, 1-8, Genesis 12, Genesis 29, Genesis 30.
Yeah. So, all right. In Acts chapter 7, we're getting to the story of Stephen here. And this is where Stephen, and so over the next few days of this reading, we're only going to read a few verses of what Stephen has to say. And then the pattern for the rest of this week is we kind of go back and look at what he's recounting.
Right.
So that's how this works for the rest of the week. And so he's beginning to recount God's covenant with Abraham, and he's giving a speech to the Sanhedrin. So can you take just a quick moment and tell us who's the Sanhedrin?
Once again, temple authority.
Yeah.
Kind of like judges, almost in a sense.
And what was the difference between them and the Pharisees?
Well, you had Pharisees, you had Sadducees, and you had the Sanhedrin. And if I remember correctly, the Sanhedrin were kind of more I don't want to say a level above.
Yeah.
Um,
We should have prepped this before I ask you that question. I'm sorry. Because
Yeah.
it's a lot of confusion there, but it's not,
let me get the
there are a lot
breakdown
of the
again real
same,
quick.
like there are a lot of the same people because Paul was a Pharisee. He was a member of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, what they
Right.
call the Sanhedrin is it's the assembly sitting together, hence assembly or council.
Okay.
It was a Jewish legislative and judicial assembly.
That makes sense. Okay.
Okay.
That's what I thought it was.
And
That
and
helps.
so it's kind of a rabbinic court
I gotcha.
of teachers. So they had a greater and they had a lesser. A lesser Sanhedrin of 23 judges was appointed to sit as a tribunal in each city, and then there was the greater Sanhedrin of 70 judges, which, among other roles, acted as a Supreme Court.
Gotcha. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
hey, I was right.
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
I just couldn't remember the breakdown.
Nope. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
But yeah, so the Sanhedrin is really what kind of happened here is Stephen has been brought in front of a religious court
yeah.
to, in a way, defend Christianity. And what you're going to find out, spoiler, Stephen is considered really the first Christian martyr because it ends bad.
It does not end well for him.
But this is also where we will meet Saul.
It's correct.
Because when you think of Saul, the first thing you think of Saul, who becomes Paul later, is that Saul is holding the coats for those who are stoning. It's hard to throw a good stone when you're wearing your coat.
Yeah. So let's not jump ahead too far, but that is where we're going. So today, though, Stephen's still alive, and he is recounting God's covenant, and really, taking some time to highlight God's faithfulness and, I think sort of God's plans in the way that he was forming a group of people, the
Right.
Israelites, for himself through Abraham's obedience. And so,
Yeah, he's using actually a form of argument
right.
that you'll see
Right.
Paul use a lot in the future in the
Yeah.
epistles, the letters. But it's very much recall your past
Mm-hmm.
and let me explain how we got here and why Jesus was the Messiah.
Yeah.
Is kind of where he's heading.
Yes. And so he retells all of this, and then we get into the stories that he's actually retelling. So he gives the highlights, if you will, but we get into Genesis 12, where God actually calls Abram to leave his homeland, and he promises to make him a great nation. It's this promise, that actually in the book we're reading right now.
Look into
Wild
the
Goose
stars
Chase.
of the sky.
Yeah, look into the stars. Try to number them.
Yeah.
Try to count them, and really demonstrates that faith often begins, I think, for us with trust and obedience to God's call. We don't have to understand it,
Right.
but that's what we kind of take here from the story of Abram, who of course later becomes Abraham. And then we move into Genesis 29, where this is such a mess of a story, but where Jacob is deceived into marrying Leah before Rachel, and it's another one of those stories where I think we can see how God's plans, will, divine purpose unfold, even through the brokenness and familial dysfunction, if
Right.
you will.
And that
there
really
was some mess.
right,
in
and that
story.
even continues on.
Oh yeah.
Because then eventually in Genesis 30,
Yeah.
you have that rivalry and struggle between Leah and Rachel.
Yeah.
And God continues, even through this, to build the family of Israel, revealing that his plans often advance through messy and imperfect circumstances,
Right.
often meaning that God's good is going to come through even in spite of us.
Yes, absolutely that.
Often in spite of us.
Yeah, I was going to say usually. I feel like usually is the answer there. We did have one of our participants say, yay, one of our comments for the week. She said, many say the Bible doesn't apply to the present world. The account of Jacob and his wives and how the 12 patriarchs, the 12 people that are the tribes of Israel
Right.
eventually came to be, is not necessarily a Hallmark movie, is what she says. I would agree.
Yeah, but there are a couple good musicals in there.
Yes, you're right. There are some good musicals in there. But then she goes on to say, it kind of sounds like the world as it is today. kind of a mess, right? Kind of broken. And yet God loved them, and that gives us hope.
Well,
So
and that's the
it's
hope
a
that we
great
constantly
summary.
come back to, is we believe God is still
Yeah.
working
Yes.
in the world today.
Yes.
We as Christians believe we have the Holy Spirit, the Advocate, that is continuing to move us along
Yes.
as we await the parousia, the second coming.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on into day 129. On this day, we read through Acts chapter 7 again, but now just verses 9 through 16, Genesis 39, Genesis 42, and Genesis 47.
And speaking of the 12 patriarchs and the mess up that we got there, is in Acts 7, 9 through 6, Stephen is still laying out his case,
Yep.
and he's highlighting how God was with Joseph despite betrayal and hardship. You have to remember that Joseph, his brothers sold him into slavery because they were jealous, yet he ends up in the end saving them because he ends up
Yeah.
by God's blessing in Egypt. And then even after all that, if you extend that out, that also led to 500 years of slavery for the people of Israel.
Yeah, it did. I mean, that's the part I think we sometimes forget if you don't read the whole story, is that the Israelites willingly went to Egypt.
They were invited.
Yeah.
They were given land.
Right. Yeah. I
And
mean,
they took that whole God multiply and be fruitful thing. They were, and therefore one of the pharaohs
yeah.
got worried.
Just said these people are too powerful.
Too powerful. Yeah. So
Fascinating. But let's take a look here. So as you said, in Acts, we've got Stephen talking about how God was with Joseph, but then we see the whole story unfold in the readings from Genesis.
Right. So Genesis 39, through falsely accused in prison, Joseph remains faithful, and God blesses him even in adversity, showing that God's presence is not limited by circumstances.
Thank goodness.
Very much like our joy
Yeah.
is not limited by circumstances.
Limited, but our joy comes from God's presence.
Right.
So, I mean, there we are. And then we move on some more, we kind of skip through Joseph's story because it's a lot.
Right.
There's a lot of chapters there, but in Genesis 42, Joseph's brothers unknowingly come to him for help during the famine. One of my favorite scenes in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Okay.
Which, as you said, was
one of the musicals,
one of the musicals out of this part. But it's this time where these brothers come to him, and he's sort of like he knows the inside joke, but they don't get it yet. And I think isn't it in that time? I'm trying to remember back to the readings, but he tells them to go get because one of the brothers isn't there.
Go get the youngest brother
Yeah.
who his father cherishes,
Yes.
and bring him. And then he does things like load them up with extra food and stuff, like
Yeah.
sneakily and stuff.
Yeah.
And so he's blessing them. At the same time, they're scared
Yeah.
because they have to go back, bring the younger brother, and they bring the younger brother back, and then he keeps the younger brother.
Yeah, it's the as Christians, we often talk about karma is not something that we believe in.
We don't do karma.
It is, and let's explain why, right? It is a religious concept that I think has become secularized, if that's a word.
Well, yeah,
where people think
that person will get what they deserve.
Right. But this, how we as Christians understand it is that
we actually don't get what we deserve, because what we deserve is
Yes.
eternal damnation.
That's right. That's right. And so what I love here is that what we are seeing such a flip of the script, right? That
Right.
what Joseph's brothers deserve, what you think, if you've never read the story before, is these guys are going to get thrown into everything. You know what I mean? And they don't. He kind of plays a few games with them, but ultimately they come
Right.
back and get what they need. So we move into Genesis then 47, and this is where we find out that Joseph wisely manages Egypt's resources, and he provides for his family, and ultimately we see God's provision through his faithful leadership, and ultimately his long-term vision, and most importantly, I think, Joseph's trust of God through all of these really hard things.
Right.
So,
And we had a couple comments here. As one of
Yeah.
our readers and listeners said, the story in Genesis 39 is quite the scandalous drama.
yeah,
Not unlike some stories we hear about today.
yeah. I was thinking it was like keeping up with the, do we know their last name?
What, the Kardashians?
No. We know the Kardashians' last name. Do we
Yeah.
know what Joseph's last name was?
No, No.
Keeping up with I don't know, with the Josephs. But I mean,
Well,
it's like
wouldn't that
they
been
think
like
of-
keeping up with the? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Then we had another participant who commented and said, I'm reminded of a very helpful lesson on the difference between descriptive versus prescriptive. I thought this was an interesting call out. It said, the Bible describing a behavior does not mean that behavior is being condoned or commanded. An important thing to remember, particularly as the other participant said, you read the scandalous drama
Yeah,
that unfolds in these chapters. So
that actually ranks up there. So just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right.
it doesn't mean it's right.
All right, so next we launch into day 130, and once again, Acts 7:17 through 29, Exodus 1, Exodus 2, 1 Kings 4.
Yeah, we did it. All right. We are continuing on with Stephen. He is now recounting Moses' early life and showing that God was preparing him for leadership even when his calling wasn't, yet fully realized. And so, this is a time when he retells the story of Moses in Exodus, at the burning bush, et cetera, et cetera. And this was the one when we were prepping for today where I had to go back because our final verse, to skip ahead a little bit, our final verse of the week is from Acts chapter 7, and it's actually what God says to Moses in Exodus, but it is quoted in Acts.
Oh, yeah, because you
so
looked at me and said, you were like,
it was kind of like a head scratcher. Like, I didn't think this was in here twice, but there it is in Acts.
I was listening to music. She was talking to me. I was going, why are you talking to me? I can't hear you.
Very confusing.
But then she goes, never mind. I got it.
Yeah, I did figure it out. But anyway.
And then we get into the story
Yeah,
about what
so-
I just
yes,
talked about. Because I
yes.
keep on skipping it. You can't talk about the story. It's so broken up.
Yeah, it's
But like
difficult.
Exodus 1, despite oppression, the Israelites multiply in Egypt.
Yeah.
And because of that, they were demonstrating that God's promises endure and grow even under the harsh conditions, because they continue to, because once people are enslaved, you actually, they wanted more slaves. And so how do you
Yeah.
get more slaves?
Right.
Right. But what they were worried about eventually, and this isn't really shared, it's a little bit shared in Exodus 2, is that whole command that, really, we don't want a bunch of men. We want some, but we don't want this, because then they will turn on us again.
Right.
Okay. And so you have Exodus 2 where God begins to raise up a deliverer in Moses. And so you hear his story about him floating down the Nile and all that stuff to be saved. And but who's gets rescue and his upbringing in Pharaoh's own palace.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
know.
Which, when I was growing up as a kid in Sunday school, and this was the story, we talked way more about Moses in the basket than we talked about Moses leading the Israelites in Sunday school for me. That was just my upbringing. But the more I read this story, of the mini ark, if you will, that Moses was put in, and that's a whole other theological thing we can get into. But his mama knew what she was doing, right? She knew when that princess was going to be there, I believe, bathing by the Nile. There was some plan there, and God's hand, I believe, was in all of it. This wasn't just happenstance. Again, it's, like we don't believe in Carmyle, so I don't necessarily believe in coincidence. I believe in providence,
Right.
and God's will and God's direction in our lives.
Well,
so,
and I love this scene as a big old movie fan. The Ten Commandments, Charleston Heston, that whole thing is, the daughter, he tells her daughter, go follow.
yeah.
And then the mother ends up has the what made.
Yes. I mean, she gets her own baby back.
Yeah.
And saves his life. It's actually really an incredible story that sometimes I think we miss the nuances and the details of. But
This is also occasionally when I tell my staff to so let it be written, so let it be done. It's from that movie.
oh, okay. Fair enough. All right.
That would be Yul Brynner.
Yeah, that's a reference I'm just not going to get. I'm so sorry. We're going to move now into 1 Kings
The King
chapter
and
4. Yeah. I mean, I have heard of it.
The Magnificent Seven, the original one.
No. Sorry. I mean, we're not that far apart in age, but we lived very different lives. It's all right. Okay. 1 Kings chapter 4. Let's go there. So Solomon's kingdom here is where we find ourselves in 1 Kings. And, this is one that is kind of marked by wisdom and organization and abundance. We're talking about the kid of David here,
Right.
right?
And so it is a stark contrast to David, who was very much the warrior king
Right.
and needed to be for that period of time. But this, and I believe did have godly leadership in that way.
I do.
But this is a different kind of godly leadership that happens, where you bring about peace and prosperity and order to God's people. And so there's a stark comparison.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, we've made fun of David and called him dirtbag David, but I mean, the reality is he was the right king for the right time.
He was. And, to be fair, it didn't say that Jesus was of the line of Solomon. It said Jesus was of the line of David, right? David was still put in that place for a purpose and for a time. And, he had his shortcomings and honestly, so did Solomon. But some great examples there of godly leadership. I should have put this with the other comments up ahead, but we had a participant say here that she had never seen it before, but noted that Joseph and Moses actually had similarities in their lives, that both had to leave families and their culture to go through what she describes as training for the work that God had in store for them, preparation, consecration,
That was some hellacious training.
Yeah, right. She said here that I'm sure those times were rough and lonely for them, but look at the beautiful, powerful people they became. And so certainly both of them went through some pretty hard, pretty rough stuff. I just talked about this past Sunday, but Moses was 40 years in the desert, tending sheep after he'd murdered someone. He went from the palace to, working for his father-in-law, tending some sheep. And
the palace to the pasture.
Yeah.
That would be a good sermon series name.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah. So
jot that down for later.
Write her down. Anyway, so that was day 130. So let's move along to day 131.
So Acts 7:30 through 43, Amos 5, Exodus 11, and Leviticus 27.
There we go. So in Acts chapter 7, now again, verses 30 to 43, we're seeing Stephen is now reminding the people that despite God's direct guidance through Moses, Israel repeatedly turned to idols. And those idols were sometimes, actual golden calves. And other times they were idols of, behavior or things where they, because we can make idols out of things that we put above God in our lives here. So it doesn't always have to be, a gold idol.
Let's be very honest with that. That isn't necessarily things that we consider bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're right.
Like we're not talking about little statuettes and things like that. Those are bad. But we're talking about things like your family can become an idol.
Yeah.
Your job can become an idol.
Mm-hmm.
Wealth can become an idol.
Yes.
And so don't think just because, it appears to be a good thing that it can't be raised up as an idol above God.
Well, I actually think that, not to get too deep into my thoughts on spiritual warfare here, but those are precisely the things that the enemy puts as idols for us because they sound good. It's not always like the evil, obvious ones. It's sometimes the sneakier, wait, my kids are an idol?
Well,
kind of thing.
And let me name how, okay? And this is my opinion. I get it. I understand it. My kid played sports too.
Yeah.
Okay? Your family's big in sports.
For sure.
One of the rules we had as a family where it was if Abby missed church on Sunday for a sporting event, that she had to find a worship service to go to. Mm-hmm. Now we were blessed to go to a church that had a Wednesday evening worship service.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But it was kind of like she made it up, and that was the agreement until she turned 18. And now she's kind of in charge of her. When really before she turned 18, it was once she was confirmed, she had to take responsibility for her own faith and a degree. And so, I think one of the biggest idols that gets used is kids' sports being played on Sunday morning.
It is, but I hate also, and this is something that you maybe will talk about.
And I don't blame the families. It's society that has allowed it.
It is, but I want to say this, and I think part of the reason, so this is really a much bigger topic for another time, but participating in those and being caught between these two worlds where I do want to be here on Sundays. I not just
Oh, yeah.
because I work here, but because I want to be here on Sunday mornings at church. But I also recognize that for many, many families, the best community that they have
Oh, yeah.
has been formed in those sports team communities. And honestly, I don't blame youth sports as much as I really kind of blame the failure of the church more
Oh,
broadly
absolutely.
for not creating the
That-
kinds of communities that we see in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
Not doing a good enough job of being the community for people, and they went out and they sought it elsewhere.
I absolutely
And
agree.
so, that was just my little soapbox moment
Oh,
here
yeah.
for the day. But, I've got a lot of friends, a lot of family, and a lot of friends that have become family through youth sports.
Right.
So I
Oh, the
understand
church,
it.
the church
I've got
failed.
feet in both,
Yeah.
in both worlds there.
But the reality
But
is,
I know what you're saying.
yeah,
I respect that.
but the reality is this, and this isn't coming down on anybody. Like I said, this
Yeah.
is, I get it. I've done it.
Yeah.
I know, but we have to be very careful that those things don't become an idol. That was kind of my point.
No,
Yeah.
I follow you there 100% on that. So I do actually, and as we move on in these readings, are very connected today. We move on to Amos.
Yeah, and I think
chapter
Amos would have
5.
spoken against youth sports on Sunday.
I think he would have. I agree with you. I agree. Amos would have had something to say about it. He says that, God rejects empty religious rituals and calls for justice and righteousness. And ultimately, he's emphasizing this really true worship that we see reflected in the ways that we treat others.
Yeah.
So not only is worship what we do when we gather for worship, it's not just our posture or our response to God, but it is also reflected in the ways that we love and serve others.
Yeah,
And,
it's very much a worshipful life.
Yes, it's how do you live that life? And then we kind of jump around here. Now we go to Exodus 11, and this is important to understand. This is where God announces the final plague. It is the death of the firstborn. And, so we've skipped here in our readings from Exodus from the birth of Moses all the way now to the final plague that is what ultimately allows Moses to lead the Israelite people out of Egypt. And we're seeing here the death of the firstborn, and it's a really tough one. And the notes I wrote here said, it in many ways demonstrates God's power and justice, but in the face of Pharaoh's persistent, and this is how it's referred to, hardness of heart. But the part I always struggle with in this reading of Exodus is that it is God who hardens Pharaoh's heart. So how do we make sense of that? I think is kind of my question.
I'll ask that when I,
when you make sense of
gonna
it,
get an audience with God. No, I think it's an interesting thing because being Wesleyan, we have this free will thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if God has hardened Pharaoh's heart, did Pharaoh have the free will opportunity to soften his heart?
Well, it sounds like it, right? Because it's like God would harden his heart, and then Pharaoh would see things happen, and he'd be like, okay, you can go. And then at the last minute, he'd be like, no, wait.
Yeah.
And then the process would repeat.
Right.
And we see that until we finally, really get down to what it is. I don't know. Theologically, maybe what had to happen here, maybe God was destroying the idols in Pharaoh's life.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know where we're going with this. I've got many thoughts, many questions.
Yeah.
It's a big, hip pocket question for me.
Podcast for a later time.
With God someday. I don't know. I'm going to figure this one out this side of heaven. It's
Yeah.
just questions I'm asking. And then in Leviticus 27, we see instructions about making vows and offerings to God, and really helping us understand that holiness includes honoring our commitments and treating what is dedicated to God as sacred.
Right.
So we talk about membership here. I'm not going to spend much time talking about this, but why do we talk about membership as like a covenant commitment?
Because membership is declaring yourself that I'm going to give my prayers my prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness in one particular place at this time.
Yeah.
So it's a dedication. It's a dedication of one's life to God,
Right.
which
And
is a covenant relationship.
right. And we need to see that as sacred.
Right.
Right. We should take it seriously. That's why we talk about it's not multiple choice. You're not doing this for us. You're not even doing it for the organization. You're not joining a club.
You're actually not doing it for you.
Right. Right. You're dedicating yourself to God through a place. So,
Right.
all right, let's move into our final kind of big day of reading for the week. It's day 132.
Acts 7:44 through 45, Joshua 3, Joshua 12, Joshua 13.
Yes, I love some Joshua.
Right.
Some hard reading.
So I'll cover the Acts and you do the Joshua.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Stephen speaks of the tabernacle being brought into the promised land, reminding listeners that God's presence journeyed with his people, not confined to a building.
Yeah.
It's very much during this time, you have to remember that God, when he was in their tabernacle, there was like a light emitted from the tabernacle. But the rest of the time, when he's up on the mountain things, there would be, or when he's leading them, there would be a cloud by day,
yeah, pillar of fire
by night,
yeah,
so that they could travel and see.
Yeah, it's a cool.
So wait
a
a second.
thing.
God is not contained within the church itself.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, but this was a big deal for them, and particularly to the Sanhedrin. I'm sure, as Stephen is talking to them, they were protective of the ability to access God. It was part of the deal. And so, I love that you've got Stephen here reminding them what they should already know.
Right.
And yet they don't. Okay. As we move into Joshua, we're skipping through some of my favorite parts, but in Joshua 3, some of my absolute favorite stuff in the Bible. I've talked about this at length. If you've listened to me ever, podcast or otherwise, you've heard me talk about, my love for these couple books of the Bible. But this is where God miraculously parts the Jordan River. And it's where it was at flood stage, and it's kind of a repeat miracle in a way, because it's almost like the echo of the Red Sea parting for me, that was to get them into the wilderness was kind of how that worked, like the entrance to the wilderness, if you will. And then to get out of the wilderness into the promised land, they got to do it again. They got to cross through this water that there's no way to cross it at its flood stage. And so they cross over into the promised land, and, that miracle, I believe in so many ways, is just a reaffirmation, or maybe for some of these Israelites, their first affirmation of God's real power and faithfulness to lead them into this land of their inheritance.
Right. It's also a sign of them no going back.
Yeah.
If you think about it, like the Red Sea and stuff.
Well,
write down that sermon series also. That'll be a good one, is when God... When God parts the water, he closes it behind you.
Yeah, it's for sure. Like burn the ships, right? There, that's it. You got to move forward. But some of my favorite parts of this, I believe it's in chapter 3. It might be in early chapter 4. But where once they cross over, God instructs them to actually build and stack some stones so that they can remember God's miracle and God's promises to them. And that has become a really central part to the way I live my life, is trying to mark these times where you've seen God be faithful, because as humans, I really believe we have a tendency to forget that. So that's, again, for another day. Let's move on into Joshua 12 and 13. So in Joshua 12, we're kind of skipping over a lot of goriness that happens in the chapters between 3 and 12. But Joshua chapter 12 shows us a record of conquered kings, and it really highlights how God fulfills his promise by giving Israel victory over its enemies, even though it's gory and their heads on poles and stuff, and it's kind of a mess. And so then in Joshua 13, we see that, even though there's still a lot of land that needs to be possessed, if you will, God continues to guide this division of territory and help them figure out who's going to live where and how they're going to get the land where they go. And I think it's just for us, it's this reminder that our journey of faith and obedience is ongoing, and that God tends to reveal steps that we need. He doesn't often lay them all out for us. It's just kind of a one at a time sort of jam there. So,
Right.
all right, let's wrap up. Where were we on day 133, Pastor Bruce?
Back in Acts 7:33, where you got confused.
Very confused.
Because remember, this is Stephen recounting the Sanhedrin. Yes. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground." And so he was saying what God said to Moses.
Yes. And when I was looking this up and copied it, I thought I'd copied the wrong thing, and it was supposed to have been Exodus or something. So I was very, very confused. All right, let's look ahead at where we're going in this next week of reading, so that you can be prepared to go where you're going. What books are we going to be in this week, Pastor Bruce?
Acts, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, 2 Chronicles, Job again, Psalms, Ezekiel, 1 Samuel, and Daniel.
So Daniel.
Daniel. Oh, Daniel.
That's great.
He called his name. Oh, Daniel.
Yeah, and if you're wondering what in the world we're talking about, just go back a couple videos and you'll... actually, we didn't put it in the video. We put it as a special in our Facebook group where I had a complete inability to pronounce the name Daniel. So go enjoy that, I suppose. Friends, we are so glad that you have been a part of what we're doing here today. We hope that our discussion has been helpful to you. We want to continue to offer you encouragement to stick with it. We know that this, change into not having the gospel readings every day may have been a little harder transition for you. So stick with it. Catch up if you need to. Keep sharing your comments and your discussion with the group. And until we see you next week, have another blessed week in the Bible.
Have a blessed week, friends.